In this video, we're going to talk about using MDX in Next.js 13, specifically the app folder. We're going to then extend the application we built in previous videos by adding blog posts to it that's written in MDX. Hey friends, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Hamid. I'm a full stack web developer, and here on this channel, we talk about modern web dev topics like React and Next.js. So let's get into this. If you're not familiar with MDX, I have a blog post on my site that I'm going to include a link in the description where I explain what MDX is and how you can use it in Next.js. Now, that post was for when we were using pages directory in Next.js 12, but the packages and the concept that we are using there, it's actually the same packages we're going to use today in the app directory. So it'd be beneficial if you read through that document if you're not fully comfortable with what MDX is. But basically, MDX is a superset of markdown that allows you to write JSX or React components inside your markdown files. Now, markdown files are a lightweight markup language that allows you to write text with a specific syntax. For example, you write this and then you will get that, or that will be the HTML version of this guy. So that's markdown. But what MDX does is it allows you to, on top of this syntax and writing text comfortably, to bring in JSX into the mix or inside of your markdown files like so. So this is a markdown file, and as you can see, I have JSX inside of it. I have components inside of it. Now let's head to the documentation for the Next.js 13, which is at beta.nextjs.org. where now I think in the 13.2 they are supporting Markdown and MDX inside of the app directory, and we're going to follow this step by step because as I mentioned, there are different ways you can incorporate MDX into the app, and we're going to look at all different ways to do that. Now again, here it explains that Markdown is a lightweight markup language to format text. It allows you to write this and then get that out of it. If you want to know how it works, it's basically parsed with remark and rehype. So the text that you're writing, it's being parsed and compiled into HTML with these two remark and rehype plugins, which you don't have to worry about if you're using the packages mentioned here. But if you wanted to understand what these are, you can go ahead and read about that. Now, MDX, as I mentioned, is a superset of Markdown that lets you write JSX directly in your Markdown files, and it allows you to add interactivity to your otherwise static text files. Once we start adding JSX or React components to MDX, we can kind of treat our MDX files as React components, or the same logic that we have importing components into each other. It gives you the same type of functionality. Now, to get started, the first way that you can add MDX to your Next.js application is by installing this next-mdx package. And the second way that you can do it, or there's three ways that you can do it actually. So the first way is to have your MDX files locally. For that, you're going to use the next-mdx. This is from Next.js team. Or you can host your MDX files or content remotely. Let's say it's on a CMS or it's on a different Git repository. Then you would use these two community packages, next-mdx-remote and content layer, to fetch those MDX files and then render them inside of your Next.js application. We're going to look at the next-mdx and next-mdx-remote. I'm not going to cover content layer here. I haven't worked with it, but that's also a great option that you can look into. Now, in the blog post, I also actually review the same two packages, the next-mdx and next-mdx-remote, for either locally rendering MDX files or fetching it from a different repository or a CMS. Now, to do this, I have gone ahead and created different branches on our Next.js 13 application. So I'm going to include the link to the source code over here. But basically, I have included different branches. So as we are progressing into different patches and updates that comes out for Next.js 13, not to break the older versions, I'm adding new branches. For example, the 13.2 was where I talked about the next font, the metadata, Now I have added two branches. One is the MDX. This is going to be the local version of MDX files. And then the other branch is next-mdx-remote. So if you want to check out the code, check out the correct branch so you can follow along with what I'm doing over here. So I've checked out on the MDX branch here, and I'm going to explain as we follow along in the documentation. I'm going to also show you the code to know what steps I have done so that you can kind of replicate and learn what's going on here. So the first step is to install the next-mdx package. I have done that already. And then what you're going to have to do is to create mdx-components.jsx inside the root of your project. So not inside of the app, but inside of the root directory of your project. This is where you're going to map different components that you want to be rendered for each HTML element, or when your markdown is being parsed into HTML or JSX, you can map what you want to render for each one. For example, if you can see here, let me just make this a bit bigger. So for example, here I am exporting this useMDX components. That's a hook. You need to export this function, and inside of it you're returning an object, and inside of this object you're mapping different elements, HTML elements like h1, h2, p tag, image, and so forth and so on, to this custom components you're defining over here. So I'm saying if you encountered an h1 tag, go call this function, and I can maybe style my h1 tags the same way or in a different way, similar for h2, and you can just do this for every component. You can also include other components that you want to render inside of your MDX pages. So this can be any custom component that you want to include in those files. Now the third step is actually going to your Next.js config and tailor it to use the next-mdx package. And the way that you do it is that you have your regular next config. You're going to require this next-mdx package. You're going to call it. It gives you a function, and we're going to call it withMDX, and you're going to export the withMDX function and pass your next config into it instead of just exporting the next config. Now, in my version, if you look at it, I have included the MJS, so it's next.config.mjs, which supports ESM6 modules or ES6 modules. And the reason why I did it, let me just close this so we have more room. So basically what I'm doing is kind of the same thing, but I'm using ES6 syntax. So I'm importing next-mdx from this package. I have my regular next config, and I'm adding this, calling this function that I got out of this package, and I'm passing in the options that I want to the MDX parser or compiler, and then I'm exporting default withMDX and next config over here. The reason why I did this, if you want to use Remark plugins, so here it mentions later on that there are different plugins that you can use with the Remark and Rehype. There's a huge ecosystem of different plugins you can use for syntax highlighting, for creating links for headings, so forth and so on, or table of contents. Most of those plugins are ESM only, and to be able to import them here and use them here, you need to turn your Next.js config into an ESM only, and from Next.js 12 you can just do that by renaming your next config to nextconfig.mjs. So I haven't included any plugins here, but I just included here for anyone that wants to actually use a plugin, so they don't have to figure out how to turn the file into an ESM module. Okay, so the third step was to change our next config that we did. Now what we can do is to add a new file with MDX content to your app directory. So what I've done here is inside of my app directory, I've created this content folder. Inside of it, I have included this hello.mdx file, which contains some MDX. Okay, ignore this export at the end of it. I'm going to explain what this is. But here I'm just having regular markdown content. Now to use this content, which is MDX inside of our app, what we can do is we can import this MDX inside of our page directory. Let's say go to our home page. So if inside of the app, inside of the site, I have this page, I can go there, and what I've done here is I have imported this hello from hello.mdx, and I'm rendering it as a component. Because what next-mdx package does, it is compiles your MDX files and turns them into React components. So the main content of your MDX files are not exported by default as a component that you can render like so. So if I now go to the application running, you can see here on the home page that I am right now, it's actually rendering the content of that hello.js MDX. So this is the same title one and list items. Now, if I remove this last line, you can see that this is not going to be styled because they're just turned into correct elements. So let's say this first line, it is actually turned into an H1. I know it's very hard to see. So it's being parsed to the correct element, but they're not styled. Now to style them, I'm using Tailwind CSS, and Tailwind has this typography plugin you can add. So Tailwind CSS, let me just go to docs and go to typography. So this package, Tailwind CSS typography, allows you to style your markdown files. So anytime that you are trying to style content that you don't have direct access to, you can just use this plugin from Tailwind and put a class of pros around the content that you're trying to style, and it just does it automatically. Now this line that I had over here is that MDX files with the next-mdx package, actually they support this kind of layout thing that you can do. So this is a layout you can export from this file, and you can wrap the content of your MDX in whatever you want. This can be any layout, but for now I'm just wrapping it in this div, and I'm giving it a class of pros. So therefore it is being styled the way that you see over here. So for it to work, again, you need to install this Tailwind CSS typography package, and then you would just come to your Tailwind config. In here, you would just add this plugin down here. And now anywhere that you put in this pros class, it's going to just style any tag that comes inside of that container. Now, you don't have to do this. As I mentioned in this next-mdx components that we were mapping here, as you saw in the documentation before, you can map components that you want to render and style them here. So you can say, hey, all of my H1s, I want it to be here, H2s here, images, paragraphs, code tags. You can just do it here. Just to make it easy, I use the Tailwind typography plugin to just style everything in one go. Okay, so that was it. That was writing content in MDX and pulling it inside your pages and rendering them as if they are React components. Now, in the next example for remote MDX, it explains that sometimes your files or your MDX files are not inside of your application. So it's not here. It's maybe inside of a different Git repository. Maybe it's coming from a CMS, and you want to fetch them as if you're fetching any other data from a database. For that, you can use this package, next-mdx-remote. So let me just open this up in a new tab. Next-mdx-remote was working with the pages directory before too, and it was a great option if you wanted to fetch your MDX content inside of a get server-side props or get static props. The older way of fetching content inside of a Next.js app. I mean, it's still a stable way of fetching content because the app directory is not still the production version. But nevertheless, they have added this support for React server components to the next-mdx-remote, where you don't need to fetch inside of get server-side props or get static props. Instead, you could just fetch it inside of your React server components because they're like running on the server anyways, and you can fetch them from a remote repository, or you can fetch them from inside of your application too. It doesn't matter. It's just the fact that it compiles the files or the data that you are fetching and then spits out the HTML. Now, the benefit to doing this is two things. One is that sometimes you don't have your files inside of your application, so you want to fetch it remotely. And the second thing is that the next-mdx-remote package also allows you to read front matter. For example, if I change branches to that next-mdx to show you what I mean, so let's switch branches to next-mdx-remote. Let's just pm/pmi, because the packages are a little different. So pm/pm-dev. So let's go back to our page over here. Okay, now what I have done here is I've included this posts endpoint, and I'm fetching my content, the metadata of my posts here, to show the user a list of different blog posts that I have. And once you click on each one of them, you would then be taken to that specific blog post to see the content which is written in MDX. Now, to be able to do this, I needed to get some metadata about each post so I can just show them here. So if I go to the content and show you how I'm writing these two blog posts. So as you can see, I have this first post MDX. So let me just close this off. Now, on top of the markdown content that I have for each post, I've also included this front matter on top of each file. So this is the first post, and then the second post is going to have its own front matter, which is metadata about the post. So what the title is, maybe this is something we can use on the page or as a metadata for the page, who the author is and what the published date is. You could add more to it. You can include feature images or the author images. But you get the idea. So I have some front matter over here. Now, so the way that it works is that if we come to the app and go to the site, I've created this posts folder and I have this page.jsx, which represents the index route at the posts over here. So what we're doing over here is that we're calling this get all posts meta function to get all the metadata so that we can kind of map over those posts and show this links over here. Now let's actually go ahead and see what this function is doing. So inside of the lib folder, I have created these two functions which take in a slug. So get post by slug, it takes in a slug. It actually reads the content of that slug, that file inside of my app content folder. So inside of the app, inside of the content, it just reads the slug. So finds that file that matches with the slug, reads the content of it, and then passes that content as the source to this compile MDX function we are getting from next-mdx-remote / React Server Components, or RSC. And what this function does with that source, which is a string, is that it's going to compile it. And if you pass an option to parse front matter, it parses the front matter as an object and gives you the front matter. But it also parses the content of your MDX file. And I'm just returning a meta object, that's that front matter. I'm also adding a slug so that I can add to this links so it goes to the correct page, and I'm returning the content too. And in this function that I have get all posts meta, all I'm doing is that I am now this time reading all the files inside of my root content directory, not root directory, but the content folder. I'm reading all the files, and for each file I'm just getting the metadata and I'm returning an array of posts metadata. So going back to this page, I'm calling this get all posts metadata, which what it does is that it reads the files inside of my content folder. Now, I mentioned the next-mdx-remote is to fetch content remotely, but you can also use it for local files. But the benefit is that it gives you the front matter, so it understands the front matter. It doesn't need an extra plugin. You could just use that compile MDX function I showed. To get the front matter and the content and render it on the page. So we're reading the files inside of our content, all the MDX files. fetching or parsing the metadata or the front matter out of them. And then we're going to map over those metadata for each one. We're showing the title, we're showing the author, we're showing the date. And if you remember, I also returned a slug. I'm using that slug for this link so that once clicked, it takes me to that actual correct page, which is the first block. Or if I go on the second block, they're similar, but it's just second block. Now, let's just go to that dynamic route for individual blog posts. So inside of this post, as you can see, I am also having this slug folder, which is a dynamic segment. Inside of it, there's again another page.jsx, which represents the index there. What I'm doing here is a combination of what we have learned in the previous videos. So for the page itself, we are getting the parameters. This is the dynamic part or segment of the route the user is trying to access. I'm calling this get page content function that we have defined up here. So let's see what this is doing. So I'm calling that function. I'm passing the slug to it. This guy gets the slug and calls the get posts by slug. This is the same function, we just looked at it, and passes that slug. This function reads the content of that specific file in the content folder, gives me the metadata and gives me the content back, and I'm returning it. Down here on the page, I'm just rendering this content inside of this div, again with this pros class, so that it is styled. Okay, so that's the first step, getting the content of the page. Okay, now what is this part doing is, if you watched the previous video where I talked about the new metadata API in Next.js 13, where you can export a metadata function or use this generate meta function for your dynamic routes to generate metadata instead of having to export or include a head component. Now this function again receives the params, which is an object containing the dynamic segment of the route the user is trying to access. I'm calling that same get page content function up there. And because we are calling it here and also in the page, Next.js is going to deduplicate this function or this response. So it's not going to call it twice. It's going to use the cached response from that function call the first time that we call. And this time I'm getting the metadata for that specific slug, and I'm returning an object that sets the title of the page. This is the title for your meta tags, to whatever title that is on that page. So if I go to my second post, if you look at up there, which is barely visible, it says second blog post. And if I go to the first blog post, you can see the first blog post there. Now, if you're not familiar with the metadata API, I recommend you see the previous video that I have on the channel. I'll include a link in the description. But basically, what this function is doing is that it's returning an object with key value pairs that's going to merge into any prior metadata that you've added to the page. So you have more granular control into what you're adding to your meta tags inside of each page. That's a wrap for this video, folks. If you have any questions, hit them in the comments. If you wanted to check out the source code, again, make sure to check out the correct branch. I'm adding different branches for different features that comes with Next.js 13 updates. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any content that I put out, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.